The sun hadn't even fully risen when the courthouse was already alive with noise. Cameras lined the steps, flashing like fireworks, reporters shouting questions no one would answer. The streets overflowed with fans, some holding posters that read, "Justice for Victims," others chanting Diddy's name like a fallen hero. The air was thick with tension, as if the whole world had squeezed itself onto those courthouse steps, waiting for the moment when history would finally be written. Inside, the atmosphere was no different. Every seat filled, every eye locked on the doors where Sean Diddy Combs would soon appear. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses, but most just sat in silence, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the ticking clock. The morning of judgment had arrived, and it carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. It wasn't just about Diddy, it was about the culture, about accountability, about whether power and fame could finally be broken by justice. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it. The doors creaked open, and the noise outside seeped in for just a second before fading back into a heavy silence. Journalists tightened their grips on their pens, photographers raised their cameras higher, and people leaned forward as though they could pull the truth closer with their eyes. Everyone wanted to capture the first glimpse of a man who had once been untouchable, the same man who had danced across stages in shiny suits, who had built an empire out of music and ambition, now reduced to a defendant in chains. The streets outside buzzed with tension, phones live streaming, anchors on every channel repeating the same question. What will the judge decide? Across the world, living rooms, barbershops, and classrooms tuned in. From New York to Los Angeles, London to Lagos, Tokyo to Toronto, the world wasn't just watching, it was holding its breath. This was no ordinary day. It was the day everything would change. The day that began with flashing cameras, divided crowds, and restless whispers was the same day that would end with one of hip-hop's most powerful names chained by the very system he thought he could outmaneuver. And as the morning of judgment grew brighter, the shadow over Diddy's legacy grew darker, swallowing the empire he had spent decades building. The clock was ticking and the world was ready for the answer. The doors opened wider, and there he was, Sean Diddy Combs, stepping into the courtroom with the slow, heavy walk of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The orange prison jumpsuit clung to him, a brutal reminder that this was no longer the mogul who once wore diamonds, silk, and tailored suits. This was not the man who strutted across red carpets or shouted from VIP stages. This was a defendant, wrists chained, head lowered, forced to move under the gaze of 100 eyes that once celebrated him, but now studied him like a cautionary tale. Every step he took seemed to echo in the silence. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire, each flash capturing the fall of a man who once seemed larger than life. Some people in the crowd gasped, others whispered his name, but no one dared cheer. His presence alone shifted the energy of the room. It was no longer anticipation, it was confrontation. The legend of Diddy was colliding with the reality of Sean Combs, prisoner. He sat down at the defense table, his chains clinking against the wood, and for a brief moment, his eyes scanned the room. Gone was the swagger that once carried him through stadiums and sold-out arenas. In its place was something darker, exhaustion, anger, fear, the kind of expression that told the world he knew what was coming, but he couldn't stop it. His lips pressed tight, his jaw stiff, and yet behind that mask of defiance was the shadow of a man who had already begun to break. The crowd could feel it. Families of victims stared at him with unshakable eyes, searching for remorse that never showed. Reporters scribbled frantically, desperate to capture every flicker of emotion. Even the jurors seemed heavier in their seats, as though the room itself had become heavier the moment he entered. It wasn't just another trial. This was history unfolding in real time. And the subject of that history was sitting just a few feet away, chained and silent. Outside the courthouse, his image was already spreading like wildfire. Screens lit up around the world. Diddy in shackles. Fans who once sang his lyrics with pride now sat in disbelief, staring at the man they thought could never fall. Some defended him online, clinging to the idea that their hero was innocent. Others said the picture confirmed everything they had feared, that the rumors were true, that the empire had always been built on shadows. And in that moment, as he sat hunched at the table, the weight of decades crashing down around him, the silence of the courtroom spoke louder than any song he'd ever released. The man who once defined "can't stop, won't stop" now looked like he wanted time itself to stop, because every passing second dragged him closer to the judgment that would redefine not only his life, but his legacy. The tension in the air grew heavier when the judge entered the room. His black robe flowed as he stepped up to the bench, his face calm but unreadable, and instantly the courtroom fell into silence. Every shuffle, every whisper, every nervous cough died away. People leaned forward in their seats, desperate not to miss a single word. This wasn't just another case being read aloud. This was the moment the world had been waiting for, the moment where power, fame, and fortune would meet justice face to face. Diddy didn't look up at first. His hands, cuffed together, rested stiffly on the table. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The mogul who once commanded arenas with a smile and a dance now sat motionless, waiting for a single man in a black robe to decide his fate. It was a surreal image, one that blurred the lines between legend and man, between idol and inmate. The judge scanned the room before he spoke, his gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. He looked at the families of the victims sitting in the front row, their eyes filled with both pain and hope. He looked at the reporters, their pens ready, their cameras aimed, knowing the entire world was relying on them to deliver the news instantly. Finally, his eyes stopped on Diddy. That pause was long enough to make everyone's heart pound faster. It was as though the judge wanted the defendant to feel the full weight of the silence before the storm. When he began to speak, his voice carried a gravity that seemed to press against every wall. He talked of justice, of responsibility, of the role the powerful must play in setting an example. He reminded the courtroom that no one, no matter how famous, how wealthy, or how beloved, stood above the law. His words weren't rushed. They were slow, deliberate, like a hammer being lifted higher with every sentence, preparing for the final blow. Each phrase seemed to land heavier than the last. The victims' families nodded quietly, some with tears slipping down their cheeks. Supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, clinging to the hope that the sentence would not be as devastating as the rumors suggested. Diddy's shoulders tensed with every word, his lips tightening, his jaw clenching, but he refused to look away. It was the stare of a man trying to hold on to the last fragments of pride, even as they slipped through his fingers. And outside, the world was hanging on to every syllable. News anchors spoke in hushed tones, waiting for the official words. Fans refreshed their screens, holding their breath in living rooms, coffee shops, and crowded streets across the globe. It felt as though time itself had slowed, as though the entire planet was connected by the same silence, the same anticipation, the same electric feeling that history was about to be made. Inside the courtroom, the judge's words grew sharper, heavier, colder. This wasn't just a legal decision. This was a reckoning. And as the echoes of his voice bounced across the wood-paneled walls, everyone knew the next words out of his mouth would either shatter a legacy completely or leave it forever scarred. The prosecutor rose to his feet with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the evidence speaks louder than any defense ever could. His suit was sharp, his voice steady, and his eyes locked on the jury with an intensity that made even the spectators shift in their seats. He wasn't just reciting facts. He was painting a picture, one so vivid that it cut through the air like a blade. He spoke of power, how it can lift a man to unimaginable heights, but also how it can corrupt and destroy when left unchecked. He reminded the courtroom that Sean Diddy Combs wasn't sitting there because of one bad choice. He was sitting there because of a lifetime of decisions that left scars on others. Every word hit Diddy like a strike. The prosecutor recounted the testimonies, the nights described in brutal detail by those who had once been silenced. He spoke of the parties that started with champagne and ended in fear, of the whispers that grew into headlines, of the people who stood in that very courtroom and shared their pain, despite the risk. Each example piled on top of the last, a mountain of truth too heavy for even a mogul to escape. The crowd sat in rapt attention, jaws clenched, eyes wide. Some nodded, others fought back tears, but no one dared to look away. The prosecutor's voice rose and fell like music, but this wasn't entertainment. This was a symphony of justice. His words built suspense. Every sentence a drumbeat pushing toward the inevitable climax. That Diddy was not the untouchable icon he pretended to be, but a man who had used his fame as a weapon, leaving behind broken lives and shattered trust. He turned his gaze toward the judge, his words sharper now, filled with urgency. He said this wasn't just about punishing one man. This was about sending a message to every powerful figure who thought their influence placed them above the law. Your Honor, he declared, his voice echoing against the high walls, if we allow this man to walk away with anything less than the full weight of justice, then we are telling the world that fame is a shield and money is a weapon. We cannot afford to send that message. Not today, not ever. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The families of victims held hands tighter. Even those who had come to defend Diddy shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because deep down they knew the words were true. The defense sat stiffly, their notes trembling in their hands, knowing that no speech they could deliver would erase the image the prosecutor had carved into the minds of the jury. Diddy sat motionless, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted from the prosecutor to the judge, from the audience back to his own hands. His jaw clenched harder, but he could not stop the sweat forming on his brow. He had always been in control of the story, always able to spin the narrative in his favor. But not here, not now. The narrative belonged to the man standing in the center of that courtroom, tearing away the last fragments of his untouchable image. And as the prosecutor ended his closing words, his voice dropped into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against everyone's chest. The evidence speaks for itself. The victims speak for themselves. The truth speaks for itself. Now it is time for justice to speak. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just a pause. It was the sound of an empire trembling, the moment before a legacy collapsed under the weight of truth. When the prosecutor finally sat down, the air in the courtroom was still vibrating with his words. All eyes turned to the defense table, and the silence felt suffocating. Diddy's lawyers rose slowly, smoothing their suits, trying to project calm in a room already drowning in tension. Their client sat beside them, stone-faced, his hands cuffed, his eyes cast down as though he were trying to hold on to whatever fragments of dignity remained. The lead defense attorney began to speak, his voice measured, polished, carefully chosen to sound like reason in a sea of outrage. He reminded the court of Diddy's contributions to music, of the millions of fans inspired by his rise from nothing to the top of the industry. He painted him as a visionary, a trailblazer who broke barriers and built opportunities not only for himself but for countless others. This is a man, he said firmly, who took the American dream and made it his own. He lifted others as he climbed. He gave back to his community. He shaped a generation. But the words hung in the air like smoke, unable to fill the void. People in the audience shifted uneasily. It sounded convincing, but only on the surface, because everyone in the room could feel the shadow of the testimony, the images of raids, the voices of victims echoing louder than any polished speech. The attorney pressed on, trying to humanize Diddy, reminding the jury that he was a father, a son, a man who, despite his flaws, was not the monster the prosecution had described. He argued that fame had magnified mistakes, that the media had spun stories into nightmares, that opportunists had seized the chance to take down a giant. His words tried to wrap Diddy in a cloak of sympathy, but the more he spoke, the thinner it seemed to stretch. At one point, he turned directly to the jury, his tone softening. You've seen the headlines, the frenzy, the relentless wave of public opinion, he said. But here, in this courtroom, we do not judge a man by gossip. We do not destroy a legacy because of noise. We weigh evidence. We weigh truth. And truth is rarely as simple as the stories told outside these walls. His voice cracked slightly, the only hint of strain, but the jury's faces were unreadable. Behind him, Diddy finally lifted his head. His eyes flickered across the room, searching, maybe for a sympathetic face, maybe for a sign that his empire wasn't already ashes. But the courtroom gave him nothing. The same fans who once screamed his name at concerts now stared with cold detachment. The same culture that had once crowned him a king now waited to see if he would be stripped bare. The defense closed with a plea. Do not let his fame blind you, but do not let it bury him either. He is more than the worst stories told about him. He is more than his mistakes. Judge him as a man, not a myth. And with that, the lawyer sat down. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the suffocating tension of anticipation. It was the silence of disbelief. The defense had spoken, but it hadn't landed. It hadn't erased the voices of the victims. The evidence laid bare. The images burned into the world's memory. Instead, it felt like the final attempt of a drowning man reaching for air that would never come. Diddy's eyes returned to the table, his face expressionless. But deep down, everyone could see it. The defense hadn't saved him. It had only delayed the inevitable. The weight of the coming judgment hung heavier than ever, pressing down on him, pressing down on the culture, pressing down on a courtroom that was seconds away from changing everything. The courtroom shifted once more as the judge leaned forward, his hands resting firmly on the bench, his expression carved from stone. The room, already tense, seemed to sink into complete silence. The kind of silence that makes every breath feel louder, every heartbeat echo in your ears. All eyes locked on him, waiting, bracing, knowing that whatever came next would not just decide the fate of Sean Diddy Combs, but would ripple far beyond those four walls. The judge began slowly, his voice calm yet powerful, the kind of voice that commanded respect without ever needing to be raised. He spoke first of responsibility. He spoke of how influence and fame are not gifts to be abused, but burdens to be carried with honor. When the world watches you, he said, his words deliberate and heavy, your actions become more than personal choices. They become examples. And what we have seen here is a man who turned his example into a weapon. The audience shifted, the words slicing through the room. Diddy sat rigid at the table, his eyes fixed downward, but the slightest twitch of his jaw revealed the battle raging inside him. He had heard people criticize him before, but never like this. Never from the bench where power was absolute. The judge's tone grew sharper, every word like the swing of a hammer. He recounted the testimony, the evidence, the trauma painted so clearly by the prosecution. He spoke of the women who found the courage to stand against a giant, of the victims who risked everything to break their silence. His voice softened only when he spoke of their bravery, but it hardened again when he turned back to Diddy. You, Mr. Combs, he declared, had every advantage the world could offer. Talent, wealth, fame. And instead of using them to uplift, you use them to exploit. That is not only a crime against those individuals, it is a crime against the very culture that trusted you. Gas escaped from the crowd, not because the words were unexpected, but because they carried a finality no one could ignore. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens trying to keep up with history as it unfolded. Family members of the victims held each other tightly, some crying quietly, others staring straight ahead with unshakable resolve. The judge continued, his voice now a steady drumbeat of accountability. He spoke of power, how fragile it truly was. He reminded everyone that the law does not bend to wealth, that celebrity is not armor against consequence, that justice is not swayed by record sales or accolades. Every phrase built upon the last, each sentence driving the reality deeper into the room. The empire was gone, and the man who had built it was about to be judged not as a mogul, but as a criminal. Diddy finally looked up, his eyes meeting the bench for just a second. There was no smile, no charm, no trace of the man who once knew how to command any room. There was only silence in his gaze, as though he knew the words being spoken were nails sealing a coffin that bore his name. By the time the judge paused, the courtroom felt suffocated under the weight of his message. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loudly. They all knew what was coming next. This wasn't just an ordinary lecture before sentencing. This was a reckoning, a final statement, not just to Diddy, but to the entire world watching. Power unchecked will always face its day of judgment. And in that pause, in that unbearable stillness, the tension reached a breaking point. The next words would not simply close a trial, they would change history. The judge lowered his gaze, the entire courtroom holding its breath as though the walls themselves were waiting to hear what he would say. His words came slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of finality that pressed down on everyone present. "Sean Combs," he began, and instantly the sound of pens scratching paper and cameras clicking filled the air. The name once shouted in arenas with thunderous applause now sounded hollow, stripped of glory, nothing more than a defendant awaiting his fate. The judge spoke of betrayal, betrayal of trust, betrayal of influence, betrayal of the very culture that had once elevated him to greatness. He reminded the world of the evidence, the testimonies of broken voices, the raids that uncovered hidden truths, the patterns that revealed a life not of mistakes but of choices made again and again in the shadows. The weight of fame, the judge said, is not a shield. The responsibility of influence is not optional. And when that responsibility is abused, the consequences must be greater than the privilege once enjoyed. The silence was unbearable. Families of victims leaned forward, hearts pounding, waiting for the number that would define justice. Fans in the gallery stared, some pale with disbelief, others hardened with rage. Diddy's lawyers fidgeted, their polished speeches collapsing under the gravity of what was about to fall. Then it came, the moment that froze the world. The sentence was announced, not in whispers, but in thunder that seemed to shake the very floor beneath their feet. Decades, a number so heavy, so unprecedented, that gasps and cries erupted across the room. Some clapped in relief, others covered their mouths in shock, but all were stunned by the weight of it. This was not a slap on the wrist. This was not a compromise. This was the hardest sentence hip-hop had ever witnessed, carved into history with the swing of a gavel. Diddy closed his eyes for a moment, as though trying to shut out the sound. But the words couldn't be erased. His hands trembled slightly, the chains rattling in rhythm with the collapse of his empire. This was the man who had once stood on stages shouting, "Can't stop, won't stop." But now everything had stopped. The music, the power, the untouchable aura, all silenced by a single voice from the bench. Outside, the news spread in seconds. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, social media erupted with hashtags and debates. Around the world, living rooms filled with gasps, barbershops buzzed with disbelief, radio hosts broke into their programming to deliver the verdict live. The shockwaves rippled across continents, because this was not just about one man, it was about the message. Even the highest throne can collapse when justice comes knocking. Inside the courtroom, the gavel struck again, sealing the moment forever. The sound echoed like a coffin closing, final and absolute. Diddy was no longer a mogul, no longer a star, no longer the face of hip-hop's untouchable era. He was now the face of its harshest downfall. The hardest sentence in hip-hop history had been delivered, and the legend of Diddy had been rewritten in chains. The gavel slammed one final time, and the sound carried like a thunderclap across the courtroom. In that instant, the world changed for Sean "Diddy" Combs. The hardest sentence in hip-hop history wasn't just a headline, it was reality, etched into his future like stone. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with cries, gasps, and murmurs that swelled into chaos. Some spectators covered their mouths in shock, others broke into quiet applause, while others sat frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Diddy remained seated, but his body told the story his mouth never could. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes dropped to the ground, his lips pressed together in a tight, quivering line. For a man who had once built an empire on confidence, swagger, and power, he now looked small, diminished, broken. The chains on his wrist rattled softly, but in the silence that followed the gavel, they might as well have been church bells tolling the end of an era. Guards moved closer, their presence a reminder that Diddy was no longer a free man, no longer a mogul, no longer untouchable. They weren't bodyguards protecting him from fans or paparazzi. They were correctional officers preparing to escort him into a life he had never imagined. For decades, Diddy had dictated the terms of every room he entered. But here, in this courtroom, every step, every movement, every breath was dictated for him. Outside, the world erupted. Breaking news alerts lit up every phone, every screen. every broadcast. Crowds outside the courthouse roared in disbelief, some chanting, "Justice!" while others shouted in anger and heartbreak. Across the globe, the images spread in seconds. Diddy in a prison jumpsuit, his face pale, his empire crumbling in real time. Social media exploded with hashtags, memes, debates. Some called it overdue justice, others called it a tragedy, but no one could look away. The turning point wasn't just the sentence itself, it was what it represented. This was the moment where power met consequence, where fame could no longer protect, where the myth of invincibility finally shattered. The man who once sang about being unstoppable was now stopped cold, his destiny rewritten in shackles. For hip-hop, this was more than a verdict. It was a reckoning. The culture that had glorified excess, power, and rebellion was forced to confront its darkest truths. And for Diddy, there was no escape. No party, no money, no influence could undo what had just happened. As he was pulled to his feet, the chains clinking louder now with every step, he looked out at the crowd one last time, but there were no cheers, no adoring fans, no applause. Just silence, judgment, and the weight of history pressing down. This was the main turning point, the moment his name transformed from a symbol of success to a warning etched into the annals of music history. The empire had fallen, the legend undone, and the world would never see Sean Diddy Combs the same again. The chains rattled as Diddy was led away, each step echoing through the courtroom like the final beats of a song that would never play again. The man who once commanded stages, who once shouted anthems that fueled an entire generation, was now reduced to the sound of shackles and silence. The cameras flashed one last time, capturing the fall of a mogul, and in those frozen images, the world saw not a legend, but a lesson. Outside, chaos erupted. Fans wept openly, some in disbelief, some in anger. Protesters shouted about justice being served, while others shouted about a system designed to destroy the successful. News anchors across continents broke into their broadcasts, their voices trembling as they repeated the words, "Diddy has been sentenced to the harshest term in hip-hop history in London." Screens lit up in pubs where strangers argued over whether this was justice or betrayal. In Lagos, in Tokyo, in Los Angeles, in New York, everywhere the news reached, the reaction was the same. Shock, disbelief, a tidal wave of emotion shaking the culture to its core. His music still played on radios, but it sounded different now. Lyrics that once spoke of triumph now rang hollow, twisted by the weight of the truth. The world was split between nostalgia and outrage, torn between the memories of the man who gave them soundtracks to their youth and the reality of the crimes that could no longer be ignored. Some vowed never to listen again, others clung to the art while rejecting the artist, but all agreed that nothing would ever be the same. For the victims, this was more than just a verdict. It was validation. Their voices had been heard, their stories had brought down one of the most powerful men in music, and their courage had shifted the balance of an entire culture. For hip-hop, this was a scar that would never fade, a reminder that even its brightest stars could fall, and that the world would no longer look away. As Diddy disappeared behind steel doors, swallowed by a future defined by concrete walls and iron bars, one truth remained. His empire was gone, his freedom was gone, and his name would forever be tied not to the heights of his success, but to the depth of his fall. The shockwaves weren't just felt in one courtroom. They circled the globe, rewriting history in a single day. And as we close this story, let this moment serve as a reminder. Power is fleeting, truth is relentless, and justice, though sometimes delayed, always arrives. If you found this video powerful and eye-opening, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss stories like this. The fall of Diddy is just one of many tales reshaping the world of hip-hop, and we'll be here to uncover every piece of it.